is Randy Ruiz, and I'm doing a timeline on the African slave trade. In the year 1502, the first reported African slaves in the New World. 1640 to 1680, beginning of large-scale introduction of African slave labor in the British Caribbean for sugar production. 1791, the Haitian Revolution begins as a slave uprising near Le Cap in French West Indian colony of Santo Domingo and leads to the establishment of Black Nation of Haiti in 1801. 1793, waves of white refugees pour into U.S. ports running from the insurrection in Santo Domingo. 1794, the French National Convention emancipates all slaves in the French colonies. 1795, Pinckney's Treaty establishes commercial relations between U.S. and Spain. 1800, May 10th, U.S. enacts stiff penalties for American citizens serving voluntary on slavers trading between two foreign countries. 1804, January 1st, the Republic of Haiti is proclaimed. The Hemisphere's Second Republic is declared on January 1st, 1804, by General John Jacques Dessalines. Haiti, or Haiti in Creole, is the name given to the land by the former Tano Arawa peoples, meaning mountainous country. 1807, British Parliament bans the Atlantic slave trade. Great Britain converts Sierra Leone into a crown colony. 1807, U.S. passes legislation banning slave trade to take effect in 1808. 1810, the British negotiated an agreement with the Portuguese for the gradual abolition of the slave trade in the South Atlantic. 1815, at the Congress of Vienna, the British pressure Spain, Portugal, France, and the Netherlands to agree to abolish the slave trade. Though Spain and Portugal are allowed a few years to continue slaving to replace labor supplies. 1817, September 23rd, Great Britain and Spain sign a treaty prohibiting the slave trade. Spain agrees to end the slave trade north of the equator immediately and south of the equator in 1820. British naval vessels are given the right to search suspected slavers. Still, loopholes in the treaty undercut its mission. Slave trade flows strongly, 1815 to 1830. Slave colonies of Cuba and Brazil expand rapidly. In the Lee Louis case, British courts established the principle that British naval vessels cannot be search foreign vessels suspected of slaving unless permitted by their respective countries, a ruling that hampers British efforts to suppress the slave trade. 1819, the U.S. and Spain renew commercial agreements in the Adams-Onis Treaty. U.S. Congress passes legislation stiffening provisions against American participation in the slave trade. Britain stations a naval squadron on the West African coast to patrol against illegal slavers. 1820, May 15th, U.S. law makes slave trading piracy punishable by the death penalty. The U.S. Navy dispatches 4 vessels to patrol the coast of West Africa for slavers. This initial campaign lasts only 4 years before the Americans recall the cruisers and break off the cooperation with the British. 1824, Great Britain and the U.S. negotiate a treaty recognizing the slave trade as piracy and establishing procedures for joint suppression. But the Senate undercuts the treaty's force in a series of amendments, and the British refuse to sign. 1825, the Antelope case. A U.S. revenue cutter seizes a slave ship, the Antelope, sailing under a Venezuelan flag with a cargo of 281 Africans. The U.S. Supreme Court hears the case and issues a unanimous opinion declaring the slave trade to be a violation of natural law, meaning it can be upheld only by positive law. But the ruling sets only some of the Africans free, holding that the U.S. could not prescribe law for other nations and noting that the slave trade was illegal as far as Spain, Portugal, Venezuela were concerned. So the vessel is restored to its owners, along with those Africans designated by the court as Spanish property, numbering 39. (1831). A large-scale slave revolt breaks out in Jamaica, brutally repressed. 1833. Great Britain passes the abolition of the Slavery Act, providing for emancipation in the British West Indies, set to take effect in August. 1834. Following emancipation, a 6-year period of apprenticeship is permitted. 1835. June 28th. The Anglo-Spanish agreement on the slave trade is renewed, and enforcement is tightened. British cruisers are authorized to arrest suspected Spanish slavers and bring them before mixed commissions, established at Sierra Leone and Havana. Vessels carrying specified equipment articles, extra mess gear, lumber, food stock, are declared prima facie to be slavers. 1837. Britain invites the U.S. and France to create an international patrol to interdict. The U.S. declines to participate. 1838. In the British West Indies, most colonial assemblies have introduced legislation dismantling apprenticeships. Laws against vagrancy and squatting attempt to keep the social and labor system of the plantation economy intact, with varying results. 1839. January. Nicholas Trist, U.S. Consul in Havana, recommends that the administration dispatch of a naval squadron to West Africa to patrol for slavers, warning that the British would police American vessels if the U.S. did not. June 12th. The British Navy brig Buzzard escorts 2 American slavers, the brig Eagle and the schooner Clara, to New York City to be tried as pirates. 2 more arrived several weeks later, and another pair later, that fall. The Amistad is seized off Long Island and taken to New London. Fall. U.S. federal officers arrest several vessels in Baltimore, implicated by the British as slave traders, several schooners being built for the trade are seized as well. Turner's the slave ship, also known as slavers throwing overboard the dead and dying. Typhoon is coming on. Display at the Royal Academy in London. 1841. Nicholas Trist is dismissed as U.S. Consul in Havana amid allegations he connived at or had no effort to suppress frequent illegal sales of U.S. vessels to Spanish slave traders. Thank you. This is my project on the slave trade.